Welcome. Global Job Hunt and the Centre for Optimism host this conversation between April Chepovskygold and Victor Perton on optimism, leadership, and what's needed to get us through the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, good evening from Denver and good morning in Australia, and to those of you across the globe. Thank you for attending. My name is April Chepovsky, and today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Victor Perton, COO for the Centre for Optimism in Melbourne, Australia. I am the CEO of Global Job Hunt and have had the honor to work with Victor Perton. Victor has sat on my board and has been a very kind advisor and mentor over the years, and I have traveled with him in Australia promoting my company. Years ago, when I pitched my idea of sending Americans to Australia to help with the skills shortage, Victor was in San Francisco as a diplomat. He was the commissioner to the Americas from Australia. I am by background a kind of a multitude of things like Victor, but I am a journalist. I've been a registered nurse for many years, and I am also a lawyer. And I have a very keen interest in what is going on with this global pandemic, what has gone on in terms of personally for people in our society, globally. And it was really only natural that I reach out to Victor since I had been following his webinar and his books, and he had been talking about leadership and optimism, and he talks to thousands of people about this subject throughout the year. So just a little bit about Victor Perton. He is really quite a gentleman. He is a child of World War II refugees from Latvia and Lithuania. He is a very personable guy, having been on the road with him. He dances, he sings, he drives us, he's driven me and friends on my team through the rainforest. So he's fun that way, but he's also a very magnificent lawyer. He has served in the parliament for 18 years and has worn a variety of different ministerial hats. He's worked a lot on technology and regulatory policy. I think that's one of the reasons he was in San Francisco 10 years ago. And he has a long record of fighting for human rights. Interesting enough, he is not only holding a law degree from Australia, from Monash University, but also from China, Peking University. And I think those backgrounds of having spent a lot of time in China will be very interesting in the future. He is an extensive world traveler, a global citizen. He's participated in the G12 summit and has also participated as an appointment with the second Human Rights Conference in the United Nations. He is the father of two wonderful children, Ted and Sophia, and he is presently the COO for the Centre for Optimism in Melbourne. He has written in 2 years 4 books, which is really quite amazing. He's interviewed thousands of leaders across the globe for his books, and his newest book is How and Why of Optimism, found on Amazon. He also has other books on Amazon that you can look up. They're very interesting. Victor is getting busier and busier. He tells us he is involved in webinars that are open to the public, webinars that are also done privately, I believe. And they're informative, but they're fun. I attend them during the day and sometimes in the middle of the night in my pajamas. Right, Victor?
Yes, you didn't have the camera switched on the other day. We had a webinar where there was someone from Denmark and someone from Denver, and you were the one without the screen working.
I was. I just don't have the guts to be in my pajamas that time and put my video camera on, and I'm sure you'll understand, Victor. But I'm going to start off this webinar interviewing you, and then at some point, if you'd like, we can do a meditation, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. This webinar is going to go for about an hour or so. So Victor, I guess my first question is really, what got you started on the path when you returned to Australia to do a Center for Optimism? And also, what is your mission?
Really very good question, April. I came, as you know, in the United States, I worked right across North and South America. And my work was made very easy because right across America, there is this romanticism about the Australian, the Aussie, our leadership qualities, our optimism, our get up and go. And so, you know, we had big projects to do, to visit 100 major corporations over 2 years. We knocked it over 9 months. You know, people would just love the Aussie story. And I remember the chairman of Caterpillar saying to me, "You Aussies remind the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." And after my mission in the United States, I then joined the G20 presidency. As you know, Australia was the president at that time, and at that super elite level of prime ministers, presidents, central bank governors, it was exactly the same. You know, this absolute trust in Australia. And then for family reasons, I settled back into Melbourne in 2015, and I was astonished by the negativity. It was like the only place that didn't get Australian leadership. And I'm not just talking about politics, institutions, corporations and the like. The only people that didn't get Australian leadership was Australians. So to cut a long story short, rather than complain about the complainers, we set up the Australian Leadership Project. And in the 5 years that's followed, or the 4 years that's followed, we've interviewed 2,500 people on the qualities of Australian leadership. And at the end of that, you know, I was still left bewildered. You know, the qualities are good. You know, up until this pandemic, no people on earth had ever lived better than the Australians of today. And yet there was this dissatisfaction. And I was really fortunate to give a speech at the Global Integrity Summit in 2017. And after 3 days of misery, I was fortunately on the last panel, which I'd helped to name, called The Case for Optimism. And it just lifted the room. And Helen Clark, who was then had been the New Zealand Prime Minister and was then the head of the United Nations Development Programme, said, "Vic, you should turn that into a book." I did, you know, and it sold well, and lots of keynote speeches. And then in August of last year, someone challenged me over optimism and innovation and said, "Well, why don't you do it globally, Victor?" And that day, the Centre for Optimism was born. We're online. We have 1,000 members in something like 40 countries, leading academics, leading CEOs. In December, just for fun, we opened the world's first shop of optimism in Melbourne. Sadly, the state of emergency says we can't be open, but it was a great experiment. And now we are really running globally. We've just finished a global survey of 36 countries on strategy and optimism, what makes you optimistic. So that's a long answer to a short question. But essentially it came from a bewilderment at the negativity in Australia and in the Western world more generally.
Well, now that you do have this pandemic upon you, as you've said, and that's kind of created some changes in your own vision probably and your own mission in some respects. Can you tell me a little bit about how it's changing your evolving center and your work?
Yeah, so obviously I can't walk the streets and interrogate people as to their optimism. As you know, I've done it in the ditches of Delhi, and you know,
Yeah.
smokers on laneways in Australia have not been safe from me. You know, they're always a bit relieved when I'm not a missionary and I just say I'm asking about your optimism. But that walking the streets asking people what makes them optimistic isn't possible now, given our state of emergency rules. And having group meetings, we're not allowed to do group meetings here, and Australians are not allowed to travel out of Australia from Victoria. If you go into one of the other states other than New South Wales, you've got to go into internment. So it's really working from the home office, but it's busier than ever. So more webinars, more phone calls. Our membership has increased, I think, 40% through the pandemic. We only opened membership on the 4th of January. So 1,000 members since the 4th of January. And like, for instance, yesterday, you know, 2 radio interviews, one very broad across Australia, another one for rural Australia. So the work has changed in that sense, but busier because there's a big chunk of the population that is still weighed down by fear and anxiety. But there's about half the population that are really driven, wanting stories of hope and optimism.
And so how do you see your center in the future helping people?
So fundamentally, our fundamental piece of research is asking the individual, what makes you optimistic? And so
Mhm.
everyone who's watching, if you think about that, what makes you optimistic? And maybe ask that question of your husband, wife, children today, a colleague. It's about personal optimism. So we're not, there's a group of what they call the new optimists who are preaching to the community about how much better they are than their grandparents and their parents were. But everyone is still has their own grief. They have their own struggles, whether it's unemployment, a sick parent, a child causing them, anxiety in the middle of the day. And so we're very focused on empowering people to be personally optimistic. And we've got, for instance, we've got the habits of the optimist. We've got lots of exercises on the website, lots of inspiring material. So that's one side of it. And then the other side is to really remind people that what the world needs now is realistic and infectiously optimistic leadership. And we say to people, the leader looks like the person in your mirror. So again, to your audience, have a think, the leader looks like the person in your mirror. And you can even say to yourself now, the leader looks like the person in my mirror. And that's what we're focused on. So the Shop of Optimism will close at the end of the lease because we're going to move on the road to the bushfire affected areas. While Australia's borders remain closed, we'll move around Australia to the places that need us most. And then we'll settle down with a headquarters in the central business district. But we've already had people ask us about setting up branch centres for optimism in Namibia and Nigeria and Indonesia. So I suspect we'll continue to spread around the world infectiously like the pandemic.
And so what would be a few skills you can just name off the top of your head? You're talking about a person looking in the mirror. This is the leader, the person looking in the mirror. And what would you advise them to start off the day in terms of how they're going to approach that with other people?
So number one is smile. Smile at the people in your household. Your husband, your children, your parents. Smile at strangers. We know instinctively that if you say hello to a stranger on the street and give them a smile, it lifts you, it lifts them. Even if they've got two pods in their ears and, they're focused on their phone, if they hear you, they'll smile. So number one is, smile is a big thing. Second, and this is an experiment for everyone just during the day, in Australia, France, a little bit in the US too, if you ask someone, how are you, which is that typical, hello, how are you? Most people say not bad or not too bad. They don't say good or terrific. But even if you say terrific, people think you're overblowing it. So one hint I give people is just to pause and say, thanks for asking. I just been on this really interesting webcast with April, or I've just read a good book. Really, really important. Number three is surround yourself with optimists. And in fact, Megan, the Duchess of, is it Sussex? Whether she's still a Duchess or not, I'm not sure. Says surround yourself with realistic and optimistic people. And Bill George, the author of True North from Stanford, I asked him what makes him optimistic, and he said it's being surrounded by positive, optimistic people. So we all know that if you're in a board meeting or a meeting and there's one grump, it brings down the atmosphere of the whole room. So choose your company wisely. A fourth thing is gratitude. And this suggestion really comes from positive psychology. And I do it with my children at the end of dinner. What were the three best things in your day? So you're still got to listen for the bad stuff. Did I have a bad day or did something go wrong? But you want to refocus them on what went right. And then, there's about 20 suggestions on our habits of the optimist. I won't take you through the last one. The last one would be thank you. You bump into someone in a supermarket, they say sorry, and I always say, well, we're doing the same thing. You don't need to be sorry. More thank yous than sorry. So at the end of the day, send an SMS or an email or make a phone call to someone who's done something good for you that day or last week or even 25 years ago.
Well, those are all very good suggestions. I have another question along those lines, which comes to innovation, because that has been something that, you know, you've been very highly involved in your career. And I was recalling a time when we took our team off to Arley Beach. We went out to go on a pontoon boat. And my friend Meredith Robinson, who you'll remember, suggested, I was sitting with you, said, well, let's go scuba diving. And I had never done that. And you said, well, what the hell? Why don't you just go? And I was like, well, I'm scared of the deep water. And I think that when you talk about innovation, and you're somebody who encouraged me to go down there into the deep blue sea for an hour, having never been trained, and it was the most amazing experience I've had almost. You're somebody who's always encouraged innovation as part of this optimism. And I want to hear some tips about encouraging innovation, because we're going through in America, I'm sure in Australia, even more so in some respects, because you have a small population there and a big country. Tell me about how you encourage people to be optimistic about innovation and technology.
Sure. And in fact, if people go to our website, centerforoptimism.com, there's a lot of material devoted to that question. And today, if they want to sign up for a subscription, they just need to use the discount code April, and that'll get them a free subscription. So the science on innovation and optimism says that you need to be an optimist to innovate. You know, there's the rare pessimist who can innovate, but the problem for them is that in failure, they get ground down in who's at fault, or am I at fault, or, you know, why is it going wrong? Whereas the optimist can say, well, shit happens. Or, you know, in moving forward, we've got to experiment, and you know, have a go. If it doesn't work, change it. If it doesn't work, modify it. So the critical question that I say to people who are involved in an innovative process or seeking innovation from the firm, the first question is to ask the team, what makes you optimistic? So it's not the Pollyanna leader. I remember doing a workshop for a very large corporation, a global corporation, and the MD got up at the beginning and gave this big rah-rah speech. And I was the last speaker. And the interesting thing was the feedback from the participants was I should have gone first. The CEO should have gone last to really do the rah-rah at the end, because it's this notion of personal responsibility. The leader is the person in my mirror. The leader is the person in your mirror. I can't leave it to someone else. You know, it's me that makes the difference. But secondly, that optimism is the underpinning of innovation, of the associated characteristic of resilience. You know, how can you be resilient unless you believe that the future is going to be better? You know, if you think the future is going to be bad, you're just going to sink in to fear and anxiety and, you know, what the hell. There's a lot of science underpinning it, but critically, you want an innovative firm, you want an innovative team, you've actually got to interview them for their optimism. And most firms don't interview people for optimism. They say, are you innovative? And the person says yes. You know, are you resilient? The person says yes. But you actually have to get at the underlying trait, which is, are you an optimist? And of course, you don't ask the question, are you an optimist? It's too easy to get a yes, no, or don't know answer. The critical question, and you know, I've had it ticked off by Martin Seligman, is what makes you optimistic? What gives you hope?
So tell me a little bit about how your work on surveys and the webinars you think are facilitating what you're doing. Tell me a little bit about your webinars.
Yeah, so the way we run our webinars is, particularly now that all the cafes are closed in Australia, we've renamed them the Optimism Cafe. You know, an attempt to recapture those rich conversations. I love going to a particular cafe that opens at 5:30 in the morning, April, and you get intelligent conversation over strong coffee. So we're really emphasizing conversation. So, for instance, I did one the other day with the head of Dementia Australia, and we titled it Dementia, well, what's to be optimistic about? And it was an effervescent conversation. And so the way we run them, and, you know, with the folks who are here, there's a Q&A question at the bottom. So we'll draw people in using that. There's also a chat column. So you can also chat with each other while we're still talking. And I tend to bring people in. So I did one with Charlie Hogg, the global meditation leader,
Yes.
the other day. Charlie and I spoke. We drew in the chairman of the centre. Charlie did a meditation, and then we drew people, and I think we had 20 people. You know, on Zoom, you can make it look like the Brady Bunch if you do the gallery view.
Yes.
And
Well,
so deep, rich conversations are what we're doing, April. And yeah, if some people want Chatham House rules, we'll do it closed. But just as you're doing here in this fantastic Zoom webinar, people love to pick these things up.
Well, so why don't you show us, one of the things that Charlie Hogg did was a meditation, and some people in the audience are very familiar with it. Other people are not. Can you give us a 5-minute meditation, since you view that as a part of optimism, and just give us just a little blurb very quickly on why you think meditation is helpful for optimism?
Sure. So meditation is one of the underpinning qualities. There's an incredible amount of science around it, but there's thousands of years of learning. The science says that if you regularly meditate, it can be as little as 6 to 10 minutes a day for 6 weeks, it will actually thicken the frontal portion of your brain from where joy and happiness and the like is said to reside. So it does that. Of course, it's good for your heart, it's good for your blood pressure, and a whole range of things. So meditation is very good for your health and very good to underpin optimism. So I've been collecting, people have been giving them to me as gifts. So we've got a couple of 15-minute ones on the website, centreforoptimism.com. And I record a few myself. So I think 5 minutes might be a bit long on a video. And maybe, April, what we could do is actually do a separate session where we actually do a 5-minute meditation or even slightly longer one.
That sounds
I'll probably do it, but let's do one for about what I tend to do with school audiences and university audiences and prison audiences is about a 3-minute meditation. So let's try that now. So everyone, most of you will be sitting. So just put your feet flat on the floor. Maybe your hands on your thighs, but if you're an experienced meditator, of course, you'll have a hand position. So just get yourself comfortable, wiggle your bottom a little bit, lean back against the chair, just enough to prop yourself up, don't fall asleep. And you can probably better to close your eyes rather than keep them open, but you can keep them open too. And so just let yourself slow down and settle down. And this, we're going to use a chant or a mantra, which actually comes from a 13th century mystic, Mother Julian of Norwich, who was unusually a great optimist of the Middle Ages. So now I'd like you to just focus on your breath, which is the fundamental for well-being, and just feel the sensation of your breath going through your nostrils. Feels good, doesn't it? Now start to breathe a little bit more deeply, and I'll count it out. Breathe into the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Breathe out to the count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And keep breathing. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. And now start to bring yourself back into the room. Open your eyes, maybe rub your thighs, stretch your fingers out, throw them above your head, wave at us. And I hope that that mantra will be ingrained in you. All you have to remember is all shall be well. And it's from the 13th century. She lived, Mother Julian lived through the Black Plague, through all sorts of awful and violent events. And I think her message, all shall be well, resonates today, 600 years later. If you'd like that meditation or a longer meditation, it's on the Centre for Optimism's website. And maybe, April, we can do another one next week, just a dedicated session on meditation.
Sounds great. So you have been in Australia this last year, moving on, and I want to get to our question and answer session shortly. But I want to ask you just a little bit about your experience in Australia. We talked a while back about the fires there, there are some water issues as well because of the fires. They have been really devastating. And you know, the people that I've talked to in Australia are just so incredibly resilient. And I was wondering some of the tips you have. I mean, now they have not only faced a fire, but they're in the middle of this pandemic, just like the rest of the globe. What are some tips you can give about being resilient in terms of what you've observed among your countrymen and also things you've learned along your journey in the last couple of years?
It's an interesting one. You know, I still remember my mother going to India with me and staying at the Vivekananda ashram, and outside her cottage, there was a sign that said, "The strongest steel goes through the hottest fire." There's no doubt at all. And Nietzsche, of course, the German philosopher, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So Australia actually hasn't had a crisis since the early 90s, and that was only an economic crisis. There's never been an existential threat to Australia, you know, other than perhaps the Japanese skirmishes of World War II. So this pandemic is in fact throwing up very interesting, reassuring characteristics. So, you know, the Aussie is a very freedom-loving, bugger you to authority sort of person. And what's been fascinating is the extent to which people have complied with the physical distancing rules. You know, I don't drive very far, we're not meant to drive very far, but everywhere I go, you see people walking in twos, bicycling in one or two, you know, if they might be pushing a pram or got some kids, but it's been fascinating to watch the compliance of the community looking after their fellow Australian. And you see the same thing in New Zealand and elsewhere. So number one, I think what has fascinated and encouraged me is the extent to which Aussies, and I think you look around the world, most people have really come together, you know, to look after their weaker relatives, friends, neighbours, the elderly. I think that's been astonishingly powerful. And so I think for me, as we're coming out of this pandemic, I see a great sense of community and stuff, funny stuff, like what you and I are doing now, you know, Colorado to Australia, US to Australia. We did a family party at Easter. We reckon it was the biggest family gathering since 1937.
Oh
You know,
my.
the family split up between continents and countries in 1940. We had the biggest family, and they want to do it again next week. My university friends, we always used to wait for a guy to come from the country to have dinner together. We're catching up at least weekly. My mates from New Zealand, we caught up with yesterday. So again, this fabric of community is looking stronger and more interesting. So if we look at it, say the bushfires, if people got out there and did what they needed to do, the Navy rescued some people, and now the media, of course, was a very negative influence. The media highlights those who are the angriest, or those who are in tears, or those who are at their most vulnerable. The media rarely goes back to cover the recovery and the strength of the people. And that's one of the missions we've got at the Centre for Optimism, and working with people like you, April, and others at Images of Voices of Hope and Call of the Times and Idea Spies, to get out those positive ideas. So I think for me, the critical thing in the next phase of coming out of the pandemic is building on that sense of community, and sharing stories of hope and optimism that are calls to action, that give people an idea, whether it's innovative or something simple, that people can do to make their lives better and the lives of their community better. Well, after this, there was a vibrant conversation, including many questioners and folks from California, New Mexico, Colorado, Sydney, Melbourne, a complete polyglot of people and questions, and a wonderful event. So this webinar, in partnership between Global Job Hunt and the Centre for Optimism, with April and Victor, we think this will be a series, and we hope you've enjoyed it. April and Victor would hope that you would join the Centre for Optimism, so you can subscribe using the discount code April, and find the meditations that we've talked about and many quotable quotes there as well. So thank you, have a great day, and glad you could join us.